What separates a man about to risk his entire legacy on a single molecule from the young woman refilling his water glass? Everything and nothing at all. That's the conclusion Julian Croft would reach, but not yet. For now, he was enthroned at a corner table in the Pinnacle, a restaurant so high above the Chicago skyline, it felt like dining among the constellations. Below him, the city was a sprawling galaxy of light. On the table before him, a sleek tablet displayed the intricate, three-dimensional structure of a protein inhibitor. A key, he believed, that would unlock the prison of Alzheimer's disease. The deal, a staggering $250 million partnership to fast-track the drug to clinical trials, was moments from being sealed. His pen, a heavy silver instrument that had signed the birth of his empire, lay beside the contracts. He never saw her as anything more than a fleeting shadow, a necessary but invisible part of the opulent scenery. He never imagined that the waitress with the weary violet eyes and an aura of quiet desperation held the one devastating secret that could either salvage his life's work or obliterate it completely. He was about to pick up the pen. Then she leaned in, her presence a sudden, unexpected warmth at his shoulder. With a whisper that sliced through the expensive silence, she uttered 5 words that brought his world to a screeching halt. "Sir, the chiral center is wrong." The air in the Pinnacle was rarefied, scented not with food, but with ambition. It was a complex perfume of vintage Bordeaux, seared Wagyu, and the unspoken confidence of men who move markets with a single phone call. Eleanor Vance, Ellie to the few who bothered to know her name, inhaled this atmosphere for 10 hours a day, 5 days a week. She moved through it like a phantom in her starched black apron, her own identity a ghost haunting the periphery of other people's monumental lives. Her own dreams had been packed away in boxes long ago, gathering dust in the attic of a life she no longer lived. Tonight, the gravitational center of the room was table 32, a secluded banquette of plush leather that offered both privacy and a king's view of the glittering urban sprawl. And at its head sat Julian Croft. Ellie knew the name, the face, the legend. Croft, the brilliant biochemist who'd bootstrapped a small lab into the biotech behemoth. Croft Bioinnovations. At 52, he wasn't a flashy billionaire. He was a man of intense, coiled energy, with salt and pepper hair and eyes the color of a winter sky that seemed to see right through you. They were eyes that had known loss. Ellie recognized the look. It was a mirror of the grief she saw in her own reflection every morning. With him was Mr. Chen, a meticulously dressed investor from Singapore whose polite smile did little to hide his razor-sharp scrutiny, and a team of Croft's own executives. But the man holding court, the one explaining the science, was Dr. Alistair Finch. Finch was Croft's golden boy, the celebrated head of neurodegenerative research. He had a perfectly manicured beard, a suit that cost more than Ellie's car, and a voice as smooth and rich as the creme brulee they served for dessert. Ellie had served them their first course, a deconstructed oyster dish that looked more like a science experiment than food. Now she was performing the quiet ballet of the professional server, refilling water glasses, her movements fluid and unobtrusive. It was a skill she had honed to a fine art, to be present but unseen, to hear everything but process nothing. "The efficacy is simply astounding, Julian," Finch was saying, his voice resonating with rehearsed passion. He gestured at the tablet. "Our compound, BDX-734, demonstrates a 94% success rate in clearing amyloid plaques in our primate models. It's not just a treatment for the symptoms, it's a reversal of the pathology." Julian Croft stared at the swirling, ribbon-like molecule on the screen, his expression a mixture of fierce hope and profound skepticism. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a scientist at his core. "Show me the binding site again, Alistair. The interaction with the gamma secretase enzyme." Finch, beaming with pride, manipulated the image with a flick of his finger. "Of course, the true genius is in the stereochemistry. We synthesized a molecule with a specific three-dimensional orientation that allows it to lock into the enzyme's active site with unprecedented precision. It's like a key fitting a lock that no one else knew was there." He zoomed in on a particular cluster of atoms. "This specific enantiomer, This is the secret, my secret. Ellie's hand holding the heavy glass pitcher faltered for a fraction of a second. A painful jolt, like an electric shock to the soul, shot through her. It was a phantom pain from a past she had buried 6 years ago under a mountain of medical bills and heartbreak, a life of electron microscopes, peptide synthesis, and the thrilling, all-consuming quest for a cure. A life before her father's diagnosis, before the crushing weight of his illness had forced her to drop out of her PhD program, trading her lab coat for an apron. She tried to look away, to focus on the condensation beating on the pitcher, on the precise angle needed to pour without splashing. It's not your world anymore, Ellie. Let it go. But she couldn't. It was like trying to unsee her own reflection. Her gaze was inexorably drawn to the complex molecular diagram on the tablet. Finch was pontificating, using simplified analogies for the benefit of the investor. Think of it as the difference between your left hand and your right hand. They are mirror images, but you can't fit a left-handed glove on your right hand. Our BDX-734 is the perfect left hand for the enzyme's left-handed glove. The other version, the mirror image, is inert, harmless but useless. He finished with a self-satisfied smile, leaning back as if he had just unveiled the Sistine Chapel ceiling. Mr. Chen nodded, his eyes gleaming with the promise of astronomical returns. Julian Croft seemed to be on the verge of surrendering his skepticism to the intoxicating pull of hope. Ellie froze. The pitcher in her hand suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds. Her mind wasn't in the restaurant anymore. The ambient chatter, the soft jazz, the distant city sirens, it all dissolved. She was 24 again, standing in the stark, fluorescent-lit laboratory at the University of Chicago. The air smelled of sterile alcohol and old coffee. She was staring at a computer screen displaying two almost identical molecules, her own breakthrough discovery, her thesis, her life's work. She had solved it, the precise stereochemistry needed to inhibit gamma secretase without causing the devastating side effects that had plagued every other attempt. It was her left-handed glove, and the one on Finch's tablet, the one he was calling his own. It was the right-handed one. He hadn't just gotten it wrong, he had it perfectly, catastrophically backward. Her research had proven unequivocally that the mirror image wasn't just inert. At the concentrations required for therapeutic effect, it didn't just fail to clear plaques. It actively promoted the formation of a neurotoxic byproduct. It didn't stop Alzheimer's. It accelerated it. She remembered the very day she'd made the discovery, the sickening lurch in her stomach. She had shown her findings to her supervising professor, a respected but notoriously ambitious man who was a close colleague of Alistair Finch, then a rising star in the corporate world. Her professor had dismissed her data, calling it an anomaly, a rounding error in the spectrometry results. He had told her to stick to the original, more promising molecule for her thesis defense. 2 weeks later, her father had a seizure, his own Alzheimer's progressing with terrifying speed. The world of academia and its arguments over atomic arrangements seemed frivolous in the face of the brutal reality of the disease. She took a leave of absence to care for him, a leave that became permanent as his condition worsened and her savings evaporated. She never went back. She assumed her research, her failed hypothesis, was collecting dust in a forgotten university server. Now, 6 years later, her ghost was staring back at her from a billionaire's tablet. And these men were about to pour hundreds of millions of dollars into manufacturing a drug that wouldn't just fail to save lives, it would actively destroy them. Ellie's breath hitched. Julian Croft was nodding slowly, the last vestiges of his doubt melting away. Mr. Chen was reaching for the folder containing the contracts. The silver pen was waiting. This deal was not seconds from being done. It was already done. All that remained was the ink. She could remain a phantom. She could turn, walk away, and let the future unfold. It wasn't her problem anymore. She was a waitress. Who would believe her over the celebrated Dr. Finch? She'd be fired on the spot, labeled a crank, and blacklisted from every restaurant in the city. But then a face swam into her vision. Not the powerful men at the table, but her own father's. She saw him as he was now, in the sterile room of the memory care facility, his eyes vacant, the brilliant, funny man he once was, lost in a fog she couldn't penetrate. She imagined other families, other fathers and mothers, husbands and wives, pinning their last hopes on this miracle drug, only to watch their loved ones slip away even faster. She saw Alistair Finch's smug, self-assured face on the cover of Time magazine, hailed as a savior, while the truth of his lie festered in the brains of thousands of trusting patients. The fire she thought had been extinguished by years of quiet grief and grinding fatigue suddenly roared back to life, hot and cleansing. Julian Croft reached for the pen. She moved. Her body acted before her mind could protest. Her feet, clad in worn-out, sensible shoes, carried her forward on the plush carpet. She leaned over Croft's shoulder, her posture the epitome of professional deference, as if offering to clear a plate. Her voice was a wisp of sound, meant for him alone, a tiny seismic tremor in the monumental silence of the deal. "Sir," she whispered, her lips just inches from his ear, "don't sign. The chiral center is wrong." For a man who controlled a multi-billion-dollar empire, Julian Croft's world was surprisingly small. It consisted of data points, verifiable outcomes, and the unwavering laws of molecular biology. It was a world of logic and order. A waitress whispering a cryptic warning about stereochemistry into his ear was an anomaly of such magnitude that his brain momentarily refused to compute it. His hand, which had been closing around the cool silver of the pen, stopped dead. The muscles in his arm froze. He didn't immediately turn. For a full second, he considered the possibility that he had imagined it, a phantom whisper born of stress and the immense weight of the decision before him. He turned his head slowly, his winter sky eyes locking onto hers. He saw a young woman, mid to late 20s, her face pale with exhaustion, but illuminated by an astonishing intensity in her violet eyes. There was no hint of delusion, no trace of a prank. There was only a calm, terrifying, absolute certainty that chilled him to the bone. "What did you say?" His voice was a low growl, a controlled vibration that barely disturbed the air, but carried the full weight of his authority. The other men at the table, who had been basking in the warm glow of a consummated deal, looked up. The spell was shattered. Mr. Chen's polite smile tightened at the edges. Dr. Finch's triumphant expression curdled into one of confusion and irritation. "Is there an issue, Julian?" Finch asked, his tone laced with annoyance at the interruption. Ellie didn't break eye contact with Croft. Her professional mask was still in place, but beneath it, her heart was a trapped bird beating against her ribs. She had stepped off a cliff and was now suspended in the terrifying space between her old life and nothing. "My apologies, sir," she said, her voice still a whisper but firm. "I was mistaken." She began to pull back, every survival instinct she possessed screaming at her to melt back into the shadows. But Julian Croft was not a man who let anomalies go unexamined. He had built his fortune by questioning everything, by digging for the truth buried beneath the surface. "No," he said, his voice sharp now, cutting through the pretense. "You weren't. Say it again." Finch let out a short, incredulous laugh. "Julian, for heaven's sake, it's the help. She's probably overwrought." He waved a dismissive hand at Ellie, then shot her a glare of pure venom. It was a look that promised immediate and merciless termination. Ellie's gaze flickered to Finch, and in that brief glance, Julian saw something he did not expect. It wasn't fear. It was a flash of cold, intellectual contempt. It was the look of a scientist looking at a fraud. She returned her focus to Julian. Her voice was still low, but every word was enunciated with the precision of a scalpel. "The enantiomer you have displayed, BDX734. You're claiming it's the levorotatory isomer, the left-handed version that binds to the enzyme." The technical jargon, falling so effortlessly from the lips of a waitress, landed like a series of grenades in the quiet alcove. Mr. Chen's eyebrows shot up. Finch's face began to lose its color. Ellie continued, her eyes fixed on Julian's. "It's not. The spatial orientation of the carboxyl group on the third carbon. It's the dextrorotatory isomer, the right-handed one. And it's not inert, Dr. Finch. It's a competitive agonist for the Notch signaling pathway. At therapeutic doses, it doesn't just fail to work. It actively creates cytotoxic tau tangles. You're looking at iatrogenic neurodegeneration. She took a quiet breath. It's a poison. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a vacuum that sucked all the air and warmth out of the room. Mr. Chen, a man fluent in financial reports and market projections, looked utterly bewildered. Alistair Finch looked like he'd been struck by lightning. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. A fine sheen of sweat had erupted on his forehead. That's insane. Who are you? How could you possibly? It was my thesis, Ellie said, the words finally tumbling out, the dam of 6 years of silence breaking. My original research at the University of Chicago, 6 years ago. Research you and Professor Albright had access to. Research he told me to abandon because the results were anomalous. You didn't steal my breakthrough, Dr. Finch. You stole my biggest, most catastrophic failure and are trying to sell it as a miracle. Every word was a nail being hammered into Finch's coffin. Julian Croft's gaze shifted from Ellie's resolute, passionate face to Finch's rapidly crumbling one. The sweat, the panicked denial, the sheer animal terror in his eyes. It was more damning than any confession. Julian had seen that look before, in board members trying to hide falsified earnings reports. It was the unmistakable look of a man caught in a lie of catastrophic proportions. Slowly, deliberately, Julian Croft reached out and capped his silver pen. The soft click echoed in the alcove like a judge's gavel. He placed it carefully on the table, a clear signal that the signing was over. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice a preternaturally calm sea after a hurricane, addressing Mr. Chen and his own executives. "It seems a critical piece of peer review has just been presented. My sincerest apologies for this unforeseen diligence." He turned his gaze on his head of research. "Alistair, do not move. Do not touch your phone. Do not do anything." He then rose from the table, his tall frame seeming to fill the entire space. He looked at Ellie, his expression unreadable but commanding. "You, with me, now." He didn't wait for her reply. He turned and strode away from the table, weaving through the restaurant with a purpose that parted the sea of diners. Ellie could feel the stares of every patron, every busboy, every member of the kitchen staff who had peered through the pass-through. Her manager, a perpetually flustered man named Jean-Pierre, was already rushing toward her, his face a mask of apoplectic rage. "Vance, what is the meaning of this? You are finished. Out," he hissed, grabbing her arm. Before Ellie could respond, Julian Croft's voice boomed across the dining room. He had stopped at the grand entrance, turning back to face them. He didn't shout, but his voice carried a weight that made wine glasses tremble. "Take your hand off her, Jean-Pierre," he said, using the manager's name with a familiarity that was both a shock and a dire warning. "She is no longer in your employ. She is with me. Add $1 million to my bill for the inconvenience." Jean-Pierre froze, his hand dropping from Ellie's arm as if it had been burned. His jaw hung open. Ellie straightened her apron, took one last deep breath of the rarefied air of the Pinnacle, and walked. She walked away from her table, away from her demeaning job, away from the anonymous life she had constructed as a shelter. She walked past the gawking diners and her stunned former colleagues, her head held high, and followed the billionaire out into the cold, windy embrace of the Chicago night, leaving a $250 million deal and the smoldering ruins of her quiet existence in her wake. The gilded cage was behind her, but she had no idea if she was flying toward freedom or a far more dangerous prison. The ride in Julian Croft's custom Audi A8 was a silent, surreal journey through the illuminated canyons of downtown Chicago. The car was a vault of soundproof glass and supple leather, a self-contained universe utterly disconnected from the bustling city outside. Ellie sat in the back across from him, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The cheap polyester of her black uniform felt sacrilegious against the hand-stitched upholstery. She could feel his gaze on her, a palpable weight. He wasn't just looking at her, he was dissecting her, analyzing her, trying to fit her into a logical framework that made sense. He didn't speak until the car had swept into a private underground garage, and they were ascending in a silent, high-speed elevator within a gleaming tower of steel and glass. the global headquarters of Croft Bioinnovations. Your full name, he said. It wasn't a question, it was a demand for a data point. Eleanor Vance. And until 20 minutes ago, you were a waitress. A statement of an impossible fact he was struggling to reconcile. For the last 5.5 years, yes. And before that? The elevator doors opened directly into a vast, sparsely furnished office that felt more like a modern cathedral than a workspace. One entire wall was a floor-to-ceiling window showcasing a breathtaking, God's-eye view of Lake Michigan and the city lights. A single, enormous desk carved from a piece of reclaimed oak stood like an altar in the center. Ellie hesitated at the threshold, the ghosts of her past life swirling around her like a physical force. Before that, she said, her voice quiet but clear, I was a doctoral candidate in molecular pharmacology at the University of Chicago. My thesis was on novel inhibitors for gamma secretase in the treatment of familial Alzheimer's disease. Julian stopped and turned to face her, the pieces visibly clicking into place behind his calculating eyes. Who was your advisor? Professor Mark Albright. The name landed between them with a quiet thud. Julian's expression darkened. Albright, of course. He sits on our scientific advisory board. He recommended Alistair Finch for the job. The ugly web began to reveal itself. I've read Finch's early papers, Julian said, his voice dangerously low. The ones that formed the basis for the BDX program. They were co-authored with Albright. The theoretical work was mine, Ellie stated flatly. The air crackled with the gravity of her accusation. The initial molecular design, the binding hypothesis, the synthesis pathway. It was all from my dissertation research, the part that worked anyway. They took the successful components of my work and attached them to the failed molecule, either out of incompetence or malice, Julian finished for her, his voice turning to ice. He was beginning to see the shape of the betrayal, and it was far more sinister than simple incompetence. Why didn't you go public? Why didn't you fight them? A bitter, humorless laugh escaped Ellie's lips. With what? I was 25 years old. My father had just been moved into full-time care, and I was drowning in his medical debt. My mother had passed years before. I had nothing. Albright was a tenured department chair with a legion of university lawyers at his disposal. He and Finch controlled the narrative. They would have painted me as a delusional, unstable graduate student. They would have destroyed me professionally and financially. So I did the only thing I could do. I vanished. He led her not to his desk, but to a smaller, more private study adjoining the main office. He gestured for her to sit in a leather armchair, but he remained standing, pacing the length of the room like a caged tiger. Tonight, he began, thinking aloud, his voice a low rumble. I was about to commit my company, my investors, and my own personal fortune to that molecule. More than that, he stopped and looked at her, his eyes filled with a sudden, raw pain that caught her off guard. My wife, Caroline, she died from early-onset dementia 3 years ago. It wasn't Alzheimer's. It was a different pathology. But I watched her disappear, inch by inch. This project, this wasn't just about business for me. The confession hung in the air, changing everything. Ellie suddenly understood the hope and the desperation she had seen in his eyes at the restaurant. It was the same hope and desperation she felt every time she visited her father. He leaned against a bookshelf, his arms crossed. If you are right, Eleanor Vance, you didn't just save my company. You saved thousands of people from a horrific fate, and you saved me from becoming the architect of it. But if you are wrong, if this is some elaborate ploy or a simple mistake, you have just destroyed the last best hope for millions. He locked his gaze on hers, his skepticism warring with a desperate need to believe. So, I will ask you once, and I need the absolute truth. How certain are you? 100%, she said without a flicker of doubt. The science is absolute. The laws of stereoisomerism are not open to interpretation. Dr. Finch's molecule is a time bomb, and he's lighting the fuse. Prove it. The challenge was laid down. For the next 3 hours in that silent office high above the sleeping city, Julian Croft subjected her to the most intense examination of her life. He wasn't just a CEO. He was a formidable scientist in his own right. He pulled up raw spectrometry data on a large monitor. He quizzed her on enzymatic kinetics, on protein folding, on the quantum mechanics of molecular bonds. He was relentless, pushing her, testing the limits of her knowledge, searching for any weakness, any crack in her certainty. He found none. Freed from the shell of the deferential waitress, Ellie came alive. The 6 years of dormant knowledge surged back, sharper and clearer than ever. She didn't just answer his questions, she anticipated them. She sketched out reaction mechanisms on a glass wall with a dry erase marker, her handwriting a swift, confident scrawl. The weary, beaten-down server was gone, replaced by the brilliant, passionate scientist she was always meant to be. Julian watched, his initial cynicism giving way to a dawning respect, which quickly curdled into a cold, murderous rage directed at the men who had betrayed him. As Ellie finished explaining the precise mechanism by which the flawed molecule would induce neurotoxicity, Julian's secure phone buzzed. It was a text from Mr. Chen. "Julian, I am at the airport. Finch has been calling me, babbling about a corporate espionage plot. I need answers, or my fund is out, effective immediately." Julian typed a swift reply. "Stay, I am handling it. The story is worse than you think, but the outcome will be better. Trust me." He looked up at Ellie, a new resolve hardening his features. "All right, Miss Vance, you've shown me the fire. Now help me prove who started it. I'm giving you my personal credentials, unrestricted access to every server in this company, the raw data from the primate trials, the simulation logs, Finch's and Albright's internal communications. I want you to find me the smoking gun. I want undeniable ironclad proof that they knew. Not just that they were wrong, but that they were lying." He paused, his gaze boring into her. "My company's future, and my own, is now in your hands. Can you do this?" Ellie looked at the complex diagram she had drawn on the glass wall. Her work, her truth, finally brought into the light. This was her chance, not just for revenge, but for justice. A chance to give a name back to her father's suffering and to reclaim the future that had been stolen from her. "Yes," she said, her voice ringing with a conviction she hadn't felt in 6 long, lost years. "I can." The main research floor of Croft Bio-Innovations was a world away from the Spartan elegance of the executive suite. It was a sprawling, brightly lit expanse of gleaming chrome and glass. A temple to science humming with the quiet, formidable power of gene sequencers and mass spectrometers. For Ellie, stepping into it was like coming home after a long and painful exile. The faint, clean scent of isopropyl alcohol and sterile culture medium was a perfume she had thought she would never smell again. Julian led her to a glass-walled office at the heart of the facility. "This is Finch's workstation," he said, his voice tight with a barely contained fury. "My head of IT, a woman named Maria, has already locked him out of the network remotely, but he won't know that yet. You have my clearance. Alpha level. Nothing is firewalled from you. Go anywhere. Look at everything." He pressed his thumb against a biometric pad on the wall. A soft chime echoed in the silent lab, and the workstation flickered to life, displaying a cascade of data streams and molecular models. "I have to go and manage my investors and my board. They're all about to wake up to a 5-alarm fire. I'm buying you time, Ms. Vance. Use it." He turned and left her alone. The silence of the vast laboratory settled around her, punctuated only by the gentle whir of cooling fans. For a brief moment, the enormity of the task was overwhelming. She was searching for a single, deliberately buried lie within a mountain of data so vast it was measured in petabytes. But then, years of training took over. The discipline of the scientific method was a comforting, familiar structure. She didn't start with Finch's polished reports or his conclusions. She started with the source, the raw, unadulterated output from the laboratory instruments, the machine logs, the data that existed before any human interpretation or manipulation could taint it. The hours dissolved. Midnight bled into the deep, dark hours of the early morning. Ellie forgot her aching feet, her torn uniform, her gnawing exhaustion. She was a hunter on the trail of a lie. She cross-referenced data from high-performance liquid chromatography with the results from nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, her mind navigating the labyrinthine server architecture with an instinct she thought she had lost forever. She found the first thread at 3:42 a.m. It was in the archived logs for a series of tissue assays from the primate trials conducted 8 months prior. The official report, signed by Finch, detailed impressive plaque clearance and noted statistically insignificant levels of neuronal apoptosis, cell death. But when Ellie bypassed the summary software and looked at the raw cell counts from the flow cytometer, the numbers told a different story. The neuronal death wasn't insignificant. It was alarming. She dug deeper. She found the calibration records for that specific machine. On the day of the crucial tests, the sensitivity settings had been manually adjusted downward, far below standard operating procedure. The machine had been deliberately hobbled, made less sensitive, to underreport the very cell death it was designed to detect. The digital adjustment log was signed with Finch's user ID. "Got you," she whispered, her voice a ghost in the empty lab. It was more than a mistake. It was active, conscious fraud. She followed the thread, pulling on it, unraveling the tapestry of deceit. She found email correspondence between Finch and Albright. In the early days of the project, Finch expressed concerns about the BDX 734 molecule's potential toxicity, citing preliminary data. Albright's reply was chillingly dismissive. "The signal-to-noise ratio is in our favor, Alistair. Focus on the data that supports the primary efficacy endpoint. The rest is a distraction. The FDA is more concerned with plaque clearance than a few dead neurons in a monkey." It was a conspiracy, documented in their own words. As dawn began to streak the eastern sky with shades of gray and pink, Ellie found the final, devastating piece of the puzzle. It was buried in a password-protected partition on a secondary server, a server used for long-term data archiving. The partition was mislabeled as Legacy HPLC Maintenance Logs, a place no one would ever have a reason to look. Her mind raced trying to guess the password. What would two arrogant, deceitful men use to protect their darkest secret? She thought about their shared history, their ambition. She tried their university name, project code names. Nothing worked. Then she thought about the source of their fraud, her. She typed her old university student ID number into the prompt. The partition unlocked. It contained a single encrypted video file. Ellie's hands trembled as she initiated the decryption sequence using Julian's master credentials. The file opened. It was a recording of a video conference timestamped from 6 months ago. The participants were Alistair Finch, Mark Albright, and the CEO of their largest corporate rival, PharmaLife Global. Finch's voice was clear. "The trap is set. Croft is all in. He's emotionally compromised because of his wife. He's not thinking clearly. He'll push the flawed BDX 734 through phase 1 trials." The PharmaLife CEO smiled, a predatory shark's grin. "And once it fails, spectacularly and publicly, Croft's stock will collapse. We acquire them for pennies on the dollar." Albright spoke next, his academic tone making the words even more heinous. "And the real prize, of course, is the corrected molecule, the original Vance formulation. Once we are in control of Croft's assets, we discover the error and launch the real drug under the PharmaLife banner. It's perfect." Ellie felt sick. They hadn't just stolen her failure. They were holding her actual success hostage, waiting to profit from it after they had destroyed Julian Croft's entire world. They were going to let a dangerous drug proceed to human trials, risking lives, all as part of an elaborate corporate takeover scheme. She saved the video file, the emails, and the doctored data logs onto a secure, encrypted flash drive Julian had given her. She had the smoking gun. She had the entire conspiracy, wrapped and tied. Just as she was about to call Julian, a frantic series of alerts flashed across her screen. Security breach. Unauthorized physical access. Sub-level 2. Forced override on lab wing. C. Warning, network isolation protocol initiated. The lights in the lab flickered once, then shifted to a dim, red emergency glow. A heavy, metallic thump-clank echoed through the space as magnetic locks on the main doors engaged. Finch. He hadn't just been locked out digitally. He must have used an old physical keycard, panicked when it didn't work, and forced a manual override. The automated security system had responded by sealing the entire research wing, turning her sanctuary into a high-tech prison. And he was in the wing with her. Her terminal screen went dark, displaying only a single message. System lockdown. All external connections severed. She was trapped, and somewhere in the labyrinth of the sealed-off research wing, the man whose crimes she had just uncovered was hunting for her. The quiet hum of the lab was suddenly drowned out by the frantic pounding of her own heart. The red emergency lighting painted the sterile lab in bloody hues. Ellie was sealed in, the flash drive containing the evidence, a lead weight in the pocket of her worn uniform. The system lockdown was a double-edged sword. It had trapped Finch inside the research wing, but it had also trapped her with him. Her mind, sharpened by hours of intense focus, kicked into survival mode. The main lab doors were thick plates of steel, now secured by powerful electromagnets. No way through there. She looked around the room, her gaze cataloging every object, not as scientific equipment, but as a potential weapon or tool. A heavy fire extinguisher, a metal stool. A new sound reached her, the screech of metal on metal from the hallway, followed by a heavy thud against the lab door. He was trying to force it open. He was desperate. She had to get the drive to Julian. The data on the server was isolated and safe, but the drive in her pocket was the condensed, organized proof. It was the narrative of the crime. Her eyes darted to a ventilation grate near the ceiling. It was small, secured by screws, but it was a potential path. It was a cliché straight out of a movie, but in the sterile, windowless box of the lab, it was her only option. The thudding on the door became more frantic, punctuated by Finch's muffled, enraged shouting. She dragged a heavy lab bench under the grate. Using the handle of a discarded centrifuge rotor as a makeshift screwdriver, she frantically worked on the screws. Her fingers, numb with adrenaline, fumbled, but she forced them to obey. The last screw came loose and she pulled the grate free. A rush of cool, recycled air washed over her. She hoisted herself up, muscles screaming in protest, and wriggled into the tight, dusty darkness of the air duct. She pulled the grate back into place behind her, just as a deafening crash echoed from the lab. He had used the fire extinguisher to smash the door's control panel, shorting out the magnetic lock. He was in. Inside the vent, it was pitch black. The air tasted of dust and metal. The rhythmic thrum of the building's massive HVAC system vibrated through her bones. She could hear Finch's frantic movements below, the sound of him sweeping equipment off tables, searching for her, for the evidence. She had to move. She crawled forward, the rough sheet metal scraping her hands and knees raw. She had no idea where she was going, only that she had to get away from the lab. The ductwork was a maze. She took a turn, then another, guided only by the flow of air and a desperate hope she was moving toward the building's core rather than a dead end. Panic was a cold tide rising in her chest. She was lost, trapped in the guts of a skyscraper, with a desperate man on her heels. She forced it down, focusing on her father's face. She was doing this for him, for all the other people like him. After what felt like an eternity of crawling in darkness, she saw a faint sliver of light ahead. It was another grate, this one opening into a vertical maintenance shaft. Below her, a ladder was bolted to the wall, descending into the gloom. She pushed the grate open and carefully lowered herself onto the ladder, her heart pounding. She descended, floor after floor, her hands slick with sweat on the cold metal rungs. Finally, she saw another horizontal duct branching off. She climbed toward it, praying it led somewhere, anywhere. As she reached it, she heard a noise from above, a scraping, metallic sound. He was in the shaft. He had followed her. A new wave of terror spurred her on. She scrambled into the new duct and crawled as fast as she could, ignoring the pain in her knees. The sound of his pursuit grew fainter behind her. The duct ended abruptly at another grate. She kicked it open with her feet and tumbled out, landing in a heap of dust and exhaustion on a cold, tiled floor. She was in a small, dark utility closet. She pushed the door open and stumbled into a deserted hallway. The lights were on, the air was still. It was a different floor, a different part of the building. She was out of the lockdown zone. She didn't wait. She ran. She found an emergency stairwell and burst through the door, her footsteps echoing as she clattered down the concrete stairs, taking them 2 and 3 at a time. She didn't stop until she reached the ground floor, her lungs burning, her body bruised and shaking. She staggered into the main lobby, a grand cathedral-like space of marble and glass, and she saw him. Julian Croft was standing by the main security desk, flanked by 2 imposing security guards, his face a mask of grim concern. He was on the phone, his voice sharp and demanding. He saw her emerge from the stairwell. His eyes widened, his usual iron composure shattering into visible, profound relief. "Ellie," he shouted, using her first name, the name of a person, not an asset. She stumbled toward him, every muscle aching, but a fierce, triumphant light in her eyes. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small black flash drive, holding it up. "I have it, Julian," she gasped, her voice raw. "I have everything. The video, all of it." As he took the drive from her trembling hand, the main elevator doors chimed and slid open. Standing there, his expensive suit ruined, his face streaked with grime and sweat, was Dr. Alistair Finch. He held a heavy metal tool in his hand, something he must have grabbed from a maintenance cart. He saw Ellie. He saw the flash drive in Julian's hand. He saw the security guards. In that one silent, terrible moment, his entire world collapsed. The ambition, the greed, the intricate web of lies, all of it turned to ash. A sound escaped his throat, a primal scream of pure, cornered rage. He didn't lunge for Julian or the drive. He lunged for Ellie. It was a last, hateful, nihilistic act, an attempt to destroy the woman who had destroyed him. He never got close. Julian's security team moved with a speed that was terrifyingly efficient. They intercepted him mid-lunge, a blur of decisive, controlled force. They slammed him to the marble floor with a sickening thud that echoed through the vast lobby. The tool skittered away across the polished stone. The great Dr. Alistair Finch, the man who held the cure for Alzheimer's in his fraudulent grasp, was reduced to a pathetic, sobbing heap on the floor of the empire he had tried to conquer. Julian didn't even glance at him. He was looking only at Ellie, at her torn uniform, the grime on her face, the raw scrapes on her hands. He saw past the exhaustion and the fear to the unyielding core of courage beneath. He gently closed her hand over the drive and then placed his own over hers, his touch surprisingly warm and steady. "Let's go finish this," he said, his voice quiet, but resonating with the promise of a long overdue and terrible reckoning. The emergency board meeting was convened at 8:00 a.m. in the main boardroom on the 60th floor. The morning sun streamed through the panoramic windows, but the atmosphere inside was glacial. Mr. Chen, who had been intercepted at the airport by Julian's driver, sat beside the other board members, their faces a mixture of confusion, anger, and dread. They had been summoned with a one-line message. "The BDX 734 project is compromised. Your presence is mandatory." Ellie sat at the long table to Julian's right. He had offered her a change of clothes, a chance to clean up, but she had quietly refused. She wore her tattered, grimy waitress uniform like a soldier wears their battle fatigues. It was her truth. The boardroom doors opened. 2 of Julian's guards escorted in a handcuffed, utterly broken Alistair Finch and sat him at the far end of the table. A moment later, a 3rd guard brought in Professor Mark Albright, who had been picked up at his home an hour earlier. He looked pale and bewildered, his academic arrogance dissolving into nervous fear. "Gentlemen," Julian began, his voice devoid of all warmth, "I won't waste your time with pleasantries. This company was on the verge of making a catastrophic error, one based on fraud, corruption, and a level of moral depravity I have never before encountered in my career." He nodded to Ellie. "This is Eleanor Vance. Until last night, she worked as a waitress. 6 years ago, she was the most promising pharmacology student at the University of Chicago. She is the true author of the core science this company has invested over $100 million in." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the room. "Absurd," Albright blustered, finding a sliver of his old pomposity. "She was an unstable student who dropped out. Her data was unreliable." Julian ignored him. He gestured to the large screen at the end of the room. "Please direct your attention to the screen." He played the video file from the flash drive. The room watched in stunned, horrified silence as the conspiracy unfolded in the conspirators' own voices. Finch and Albright's plot with the PharmaLife CEO to scuttle the company, to knowingly push a toxic drug toward human trials, to steal Ellie's real curative formula and profit from the wreckage. When the video ended, a profound, tomb-like silence filled the room. Mr. Chen looked physically ill. The other board members stared, aghast, from the screen to the two men at the end of the table. Finch was openly weeping. Albright was ashen-faced, his academic reputation and his entire life crumbling to dust before his eyes. As of this morning, Julian continued, his voice like chipping stone, this video and all supporting evidence have been delivered to the U.S. Attorney's Office and the SEC. Warrants are being issued as we speak. Our competitor, PharmaLife, is about to be the subject of the largest corporate espionage investigation in the industry's history. He rose to his feet and walked slowly down the length of the table until he stood looming over Finch and Albright. You two didn't just try to defraud my company. You were prepared to poison people. You were going to let sick, desperate human beings, who would have trusted you with their lives, inject a substance you knew would make them worse. For money. The only reason that isn't happening is because of her. He pointed back at Ellie. Because a waitress, a woman you dismissed as a nobody, a woman you tried to erase, had more scientific integrity and human decency in her little finger than the two of you have in your entire miserable beings. She was serving you dinner while you were plotting to ruin lives, and she had the courage to speak. You will not be fired. You will be prosecuted, and I will personally fund the civil suits from every trial participant you were about to harm. I will see to it that neither of you ever sees the light of day as a free man again. He turned to his guards. Get them out of my building. The guards hauled the two men to their feet and dragged them from the room. Julian walked back to the head of the table. He looked at his stunned board members, at Mr. Chen. The BDX 734 project is dead, he said decisively. However, he looked at Ellie, and for the first time, a genuine, admiring smile touched his lips. The Vance project is just beginning. Ms. Vance's original research, the correct, safe, and effective molecule, has been in our possession all along, buried in our own servers. It is the real cure we've been looking for. He looked around the table. Our company was on the brink of disaster. Today, we are on the verge of the single greatest medical breakthrough of this century. But we will do it the right way, with the right person leading the science. He turned to Ellie. Eleanor Vance, I am formally offering you the position of Chief Scientific Officer and Executive Vice President of Croft Bio-Innovations, with a full board seat and a 10% equity stake in the company. Your first order of business will be to build a team and take your original drug into development. Ellie stared at him, the sheer magnitude of the offer washing over her. The room was silent, every eye on her. She thought of her father. She thought of the last 6 years of her life, the quiet desperation, the erased dreams. She took a deep breath, and the exhausted waitress finally, completely receded, leaving only the brilliant scientist in her place. I accept, she said, her voice clear and strong. On one condition. Name it, Julian said without hesitation. The drug, she said. We're not going to name it after me. We're going to name it after my father, the James Vance Initiative. A slow, broad smile spread across Julian Croft's face. The James Vance Initiative it is. Welcome home, Dr. Vance. 1 year later, Dr. Eleanor Vance stood in the sunlit atrium of the newly christened James Vance Center for Neurodegenerative Research. She wore a tailored suit and a crisp white lab coat, a uniform she had earned back. The center was a state-of-the-art facility, a testament to what happened when integrity was finally given the resources it deserved. The first human trials for Vancian, the drug born from her original thesis, had just concluded. The results were more than promising. They were miraculous. Early-stage patients showed not just a halt in cognitive decline, but a marked improvement. It was the breakthrough the world had been waiting for. She held her phone, looking at a picture sent from her father's care facility. He was sitting in the gardens, and for the first time in years, there was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, a faint smile on his face. He was one of the first recipients of the drug in a compassionate use program. It wouldn't reverse all the damage, but it had stopped the tide. It had given her back a piece of her father. There was a knock on her office door. It was Julian, holding 2 glasses of champagne. "A toast," he said, handing her a glass, "to Alistair Finch and Mark Albright, both sentenced to 25 years to life, and to Pharmalife, currently being dismantled and sold for parts by federal regulators." They clinked glasses. "Justice," Ellie said quietly. "And to you, Ellie," Julian said, his voice softer. "I went to that restaurant to risk a fortune on a formula. I had no idea I'd end up finding the person who wrote it. I thought I had lost the part of me that could believe in miracles." "It wasn't a miracle," Ellie said, looking out the window at the world she was about to change. "It was just science. Someone just needed to have the courage to tell the truth." She had been a ghost in the machine of the world, an invisible woman trained to be ignored. But she learned that a whisper of truth, spoken at the right moment, could be louder than an explosion. It could topple empires, save lives, and, in the end, bring a lost scientist, a brilliant daughter, all the way back home.